It is my great pleasure to introduce the man you've all come here tonight to see. As you probably all know, he is a prolific writer, a great historian, but best of all, he's a Southern California boy. He was born here in Glendale and was swooped out of the country at the young age of 4 and taken to parts unknown in Colorado. But he is a third-generation Californian. He is a great friend to this Civil War Roundtable. He has spoken to us many times before, and I'm sure he will not disappoint this evening. I give you Gary Gallagher.
Thank you. I've spoken to the Roundtable many times, but never at the same place twice. Which I think is interesting. I don't know what that means. My topic tonight is the Grand Review. The Grand Review of United States Forces held in Washington, D.C. on May 23rd and 24th, 1865. It featured more than 150,000 soldiers from the armies of George Gordon Meade, the Army of the Potomac, and the armies of the Tennessee and Georgia, commanded by William Tecumseh Sherman. What I want to do tonight is twofold. First, I want to try to capture through the words of those who were present some sense of the review's contemporary meaning, that is, contemporary to the time, and in a larger framework, try to capture some of what it tells us about how the wartime generation understood what had been at stake during the war. The second thing I want to do is explore how a number of scholars have dealt with the review, with an eye toward the sometimes striking disjuncture between mid-19th century evidence and modern interpretations. But I'll start with the review itself. Perfect weather greeted veterans and onlookers for the event, warming from a low of 68 at 7 a.m. to a high of 75 at 2 p.m. on both days. The District of Columbia's fire department swept and watered down Pennsylvania Avenue, which effectively suppressed dust, and the units began to form early in the morning near the Capitol building, which recently had been draped in black for Abraham Lincoln, who had been assassinated just a short time before. On the 23rd, it was also festooned with red, white, and blue bunting, and there was a huge banner on the newly domed building that symbolized American democracy, proclaiming, quote, "The only national debt we can never pay is the debt we owe our victorious soldiers." Leading units stepped off about 9 a.m. and proceeded down Pennsylvania Avenue, going past the War Department and the Executive Mansion, as they called it, the White House, and finishing near the Treasury Department. President Andrew Johnson and members of his cabinet, along with General U.S. Grant and other dignitaries, took in the pageant, which consumed between 6 and 7 hours each day, from a reviewing stand that had been erected near the Executive Mansion. Packed several people deep along most of the route, the crowd included men and women, young and old, black and white, and many of them dressed up as for a formal occasion. Newspaper correspondents and other observers gave various estimates of the crowd that ranged from about 50,000 to more than 100,000 who had come into Washington, in addition to the people who lived in the city and near the city who turned out to honor the soldiers. The Army of the Potomac took center stage on the first day, followed by Sherman's commands on the second. Officers and soldiers in the ranks left vivid accounts of this stirring experience. William Ray was an enlisted man whose 7th Wisconsin Infantry formed part of the famous Iron Brigade of the Army of the Potomac, probably the most famous unit, either that or the Irish Brigade in that army. Ray recorded in his journal, "The streets and every available place to see was crowded with spectators, and prominent among them was the President and Cabinet and heads of all the different departments and bureaus and all the foreign ministers. No blunders marred the procession," said Ray, who concluded, "Today was a grand affair." A member of the 128th New York Infantry, the Ulster Regiment, which fought with the 2nd and 3rd Corps, admitted, quote, "being very tired and footsore after marching more than 4 miles in the review. The streets have been crowded with spectators, among them many of our wounded boys from the hospital who managed to come out and see us." John Hill Ferguson was a Scottish immigrant in the 10th Illinois Infantry who fought with the Army of the Tennessee in Sherman's campaigns in the Deep South. He described, quote, "sidewalks crowded with people of all ages, with buckets filled with ice water or cold spring water, inviting all of us soldiers to drink. Ferguson mentioned that young girls, gaily dressed, skipped along with their hands full of roses, presenting the soldiers with bouquets. Ferguson remarked that the private soldiers are the ones that done the hard fighting, and they're the ones that needs the praise. He also noted the large banner on the Capitol, but he changed the language a little. He substituted "our Union defenders" for "the victorious soldiers," which I think is a telling change, indicating the centrality of Union to most soldiers' conceptions of what had been most obviously at stake in the conflict. Major General Oliver Otis Howard, who'd just been appointed head of the Freedmen's Bureau, had served with the Army of the Potomac through Gettysburg, you all know this, and then commanded the Army of the Tennessee in Georgia and the Carolinas under Sherman. He and Sherman rode side by side down Pennsylvania Avenue. Our Western armies, competing in a friendly way with the Eastern, behaved magnificently at that review, recalled Howard. He was impressed by, quote, "the vast multitude of people lining the streets, occupying every elevated stand, even covering the roofs of buildings from the Capitol to the War Department." He noted appreciative cheering and shouting and said that it reached such a level that, quote, "none of the soldiers who participated could ever forget that day or the magnificent recognition of their work." Sherman is also, of course, going to write about it. He writes about everything. There's no one like Sherman. Almost no thought goes unrecorded by William Tecumseh Sherman. He described, quote, "crowds of men, women, and children densely lining the sidewalks and almost obstructing the way." Mary Ann Bickerdike, whose tireless labors to provide medical care for Western soldiers won her the sobriquet Mother Bickerdike, had earned Sherman's admiration, and he allowed her to ride side saddle in a plain calico dress, accompanying the officers of his old command, the 15th Corps. She is the only prominent woman in the entire Grand Review. Sherman stopped when he got to the Treasury building to look back up Pennsylvania Avenue, and he marveled at the sight. The column was compact, and the glittering muskets looked like a solid mass of steel, moving with the regularity of a pendulum. After the last units passed, thousands of spectators still lingered to express their sense of the confidence in the strength of a government which could claim such an army. He gives that view from the point almost exactly where his very impressive statue is in Washington today, right? Just a few dozen yards from the Treasury building. It's one of the great Civil War monuments in the country. Colonel Charles S. Wainwright, many of you are familiar with his letters, which Alan Nevins edited. He's an artillerist in the Army of the Potomac. He echoed Sherman in alluding to the powerful connection between the nation and its armed citizenry. Wainwright took special pride in what he considered the American, and he underlined that word, character of the review. "Europeans would have made much more of a show of it than we do," he commented in his journal. "In Washington, all the ornamenting of the streets and buildings was very crude, and the armies lacked the variety, style, and showiness of uniforms typical in European military forces. Still, it was a grand sight," concluded Wainwright, "and it was perfectly appropriate for a democratic republic. 130,000 citizen soldiers with everything for service and not a particle for appearance." A few individual units stood out as especially colorful. Zouaves from the Army of the Potomac, with their distinctive uniforms, or we might say ridiculous uniforms, based on the French North African infantry. Anybody who wore a Zouave uniform through the whole war really should get together with people who overbid for books. One of the spectators noted the Zouaves, said that they brought out a rapturous volley of applause. And of course, George Armstrong Custer also couldn't control himself during the Grand Review, and he had the soldiers, the cavalry of his 3rd Division of the Army of the Potomac, don long red neckties that added a swaggering edge to their already formidable presence near the van of the first day's parade. Custer's troopers, recalled Elizabeth Bacon Custer proudly, were distinguishable far down the street by the scarlet neckties. That's our boy Custer's very first thought every morning, very first, what about me? No body of troops cut a more impressive figure than the Irish Brigade. Its ranks cruelly thinned by appalling casualties on a number of battlefields. Part of the Army, the Potomac 2nd Corps, the brigade, quote, gave out their cheers with such stentorian vim as roused the multitude to tumultuous excitement. One newspaper correspondent singled out the Irish Brigade, telling its Midwestern readers of its, quote, fine appearance, every soldier in it having a sprig of green boxwood in his cap. The green flag of Erin was carried beside the national colors, and the tattered battle flags gave token of the hard service they have seen. Those green flags of the Irish Brigade really stood out. When I worked on the book about art and movies, I figured out one reason why painters, modern painters, paint the Irish Brigade so often, because they get a different flag. They get a green flag to put in the Irish Brigade paintings, and they also get two audiences, Civil War buffs and professional Irish people. Few other regimental flags were as recognizable as the green Irish banners, but all of these flags joined the national colors to touch a deep chord among the audience. All of you know the United States regiments in the war carried the U.S. colors, and they carried their state colors. Each one of them did, and very distinctive, and they meant an enormous amount to the men in the ranks, these colors did. Describing Sherman's armies as especially warlike, one young woman thought, quote, their flags looked as if they had met the enemy and conquered. Some of them, nothing left but the fringe and tassels, some with the staff broken and spliced. A member of the 105th Ohio Infantry informed his mother on May 27th, we had many praises, cheers, and hurrahs heaped on us when they saw our tattered flag. The proximity of state and U.S. flags provided another reminder of how constituent parts had coalesced into a national military whole. Charles A. Page of the New York Tribune dwelled on this phenomenon. One thing both yesterday and today, he wrote on May 24th, never failed to call forth cheers, and that was the old flags, the tattered, torn, stained flags, frayed to shreds, staffs with a few sprays of lint-like silk. These were loudly cheered time after time. A Massachusetts regiment, its state colors reduced to a few shreds, as one account had it, had attached a score of bright new streamers, each having the name of one of the battles of the regiment, and wasn't that cheered, remarked this correspondent. Gazing up Pennsylvania Avenue on the 23rd, the New York Times' correspondent described a continuous moving line as far as the eye could see of national, state, division, brigade, regiment, and other flags. Some of them were new, the stars of gold leaf glittering in the sun, and these contrasted strongly with flags borne in the procession tattered in battle or mere shreds. Other flags were thickly covered with names and dates of battlefields where victories were won by these proud veterans. A third newspaper pronounced some of the ragged flags so funereal that they seemed to have been playthings in the grave rather than fashioned by the soft fingers of women. Women made many of the state flags, especially, as you know. Obviously wounded soldiers, and especially officers, stood out among the cavalcade of men passing the crowds and inspired emotions similar to those aroused when people saw these scarred regimental standards. A heartfelt reception greeted maimed commanders, such as General Howard, who had lost his right arm in the Battle of Fair Oaks on June 1st, 1862. Every officer who wore an empty sleeve or showed that he had been wounded, observed the Baltimore Sun, was heartily cheered by the crowds along the sidewalk. The gallant Major General Howard was thus distinguished throughout the day. The press and onlookers also lavished attention on other generals, and most notably Sherman and the various corps commanders who had served in both armies, but most notably Sherman. One newspaper reported that, quote, great applause greeted Sherman everywhere, and he was the recipient of many fine bouquets and wreaths. Indeed, so lavish were the ladies with bouquets that the general was obliged to call members of his staff to help give assistance to take care of them. And I'll come back to Custer for just a minute. Inveterately focused on himself, always seeking the limelight, he attracted more attention on May 23rd than any other soldier in the Army of the Potomac. And he did it when his horse bolted, right in front of the main reviewing stand by the White House. He appeared to have lost control of the animal briefly, but a superb horseman, he lost his hat, his flamboyant chapeau, but he did manage to bring the beast back under control and then trotted on back to his men. I don't believe for a second that he lost control of these things in the Grand Review. He's one of the best horsemen in the Army of the Potomac. There's not the slightest chance that he did, but he made the most of his moment, and as usual, got a lot of attention for it. Is that enough attention, George? Not quite. Give me more. Commissioner of Public Buildings Benjamin Brown French, who kept one of the great 19th century diaries. If you're looking for really great diaries, grab French's diary. He kept a very detailed account, and he recorded a perspective from the sidelines of people going by. He fastened a gilded eagle over his front door and hung a large American flag across the street side of his residence for the troops to see as they went by. At one point, Brown climbed up in the Capitol dome, and from there, quote, "I could see troops by the thousands in every direction. I presume there were more than 50,000 in sight at one time. It was a grand and a brave sight." Brown closed with a paean to volunteers who had salvaged the work of the founding generation. "God bless them all," he wrote, "brave veterans who have fought and bled to preserve the liberties for which their fathers fought so well. My eyes moistened with joy to think that they were on their way home." And he underlined home. I suspect that more soldiers were visible in one place at one time here than at any place except on the morning of December 13th at the Battle of Fredericksburg, when that great amphitheatrical setting between Falmouth Heights and Marie's Heights on the other side allowed people to see perhaps 100,000 soldiers at one time. This is an enormous number of men that were visible in one place, easily. Newspaper coverage of the Grand Review dealt with the meanings of victory and how United States soldiers fit into conceptions of the nation. Overwhelmingly celebratory and exceptionalist in tone, the reporting lauded citizens in uniform from across the loyal states who had waged sanguinary battles to save the Union, and by extension to confirm the rule of constitutional law and to preserve the example of small d democratic self-government for people around the world. They thought in terms of what was going on here and how it resonated in the world, not just how it resonated in the United States and in the Confederacy. The Philadelphia Press, edited by Republican John W. Forney, affirmed that the nation owed soldiers, quote, "benefits and tokens of its gratitude during all their future lives because they have won what will be considered an immortal struggle for the salvation of the Republic." Restoration of the Union, explained a paper in Baltimore, stood as, quote, "a success filled with assurances of reunion and peace, of law vindicated and order restored, of freedom and national strength." Lois Bryan Adams, a Republican who covered the parade for the Detroit Advertiser and Tribune, wrote a brief tribute to soldiers as, quote, "citizens who know the value of their country and their government. They saw the danger menacing both. They made heroes of themselves. They have averted the danger, have given a progressive interpretation to the Constitution, emancipation, and are now quietly disbanding to go home and be citizens again." James Gordon Bennett's New York Herald, I'm going to come back to the theme of citizens in just a minute. The New York Herald, which was a Democratic sheet with the largest European readership among all American newspapers, it took a decidedly international stance in applauding the accomplishments of United States soldiers in protecting, again, small d democracy in a world dominated from the perspective of these people by monarchs and oligarchs and aristocrats. The revolutions of the 1840s had failed. Europe was going the wrong way, in the view of people in the United States. All democracy-loving people of the world, insisted the editors of the Herald, owed a great debt to these blue-clad soldiers. From one end of the earth to the other, concluded the Herald with a hyperbolic flourish, the souls of men would march on long after their deaths, on till the soldiers of Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan have saved the world as they have saved the Union. This is echoing Lincoln's last best hope of earth. What's at stake in this war? It's not just whether the United States will be put back together, but whether small d democracy will have a chance in the world. These quotations, which are representative of countless others, make one thing very clear, I think. For the thousands of spectators along Pennsylvania Avenue, the marching soldiers bespoke the impressive military power of a mobilized populace. Citizen soldiers who had risked all in a brutal war and stood as exemplars of disinterested, patriotic service and sacrifice. These soldiers had come forth in, quote, tribute to free government, as one newspaper put it, representatives of every loyal state to struggle, shoulder to shoulder for their common country. They were our friends, our brothers and sons, our fellow citizens, our people. And they sometimes would use people in a way that echoed the preamble of the Constitution. It's from the people that the nation derived its power, and it's the people who are saving that nation when it's imperiled by the greatest threats in its existence to this point. The throngs who attended the Grand Review celebrated the fact that Meade's and Sherman's soldiers soon would revert to their pre-war status of American citizens. This reversion represented continuity in its most important meaning. Continuity from the revolutionary example of George Washington and the Continental Army, to Andrew Jackson and his Tennessee and Kentucky volunteers at New Orleans in 1815, to the more than 2 million soldiers who put on blue uniforms and brought rebels to heel across the Confederacy. Americans cherished few things so much as the idea that their national history, unlike those of all the European powers, rested on the Republican virtue of citizens willing to sacrifice in times of military crisis. What other nation could boast of anyone like George Washington? What couldn't the Europeans understand about George Washington? An American Cincinnatus who gave up supreme military power to resume his civilian pursuits at Mount Vernon after the Revolutionary War. What is he not? He is not Caesar. He's not Napoleon. He's not Cromwell. This is what the United States has that no other place has, according to people in the mid-19th century. The veterans in the Grand Review, in their more modest way, followed directly in Washington's Republican footsteps. Anyone who fails to appreciate the political and cultural importance of the citizen soldier has no chance of understanding the Civil War. None. Not a slight chance, no chance. And nowhere does that importance stand out more clearly than in the Grand Review. And it's always worth keeping in mind that a majority of all the soldiers who put on uniforms in the Civil War, more than 3 million of them on both sides, were true volunteers. They went into service before there was conscription in either the United States or the Confederacy. The most obvious missing figure on May 23rd, 24 generated considerable comment. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles sat where, as he put it, the President, Cabinet, generals, and high naval officers shared space with their wives and others. His voluminous diary includes nothing regarding the decision to limit the parade to soldiers, though he surely believed that men who had served aboard United States naval vessels surely had an equal claim to having given service to the Republic. There are no sailors in the Grand Review. He didn't comment about them, but he did comment about the person whose absence stood out. Abraham Lincoln was not there. Wells wrote sadly of the martyred president. All felt this. As I suggested at the beginning of my talk, the Grand Review gives us a striking example of tension between contemporary meanings and subsequent analysis of a historical event. For veterans who marched in the Review and spectators who watched and cheered, as the quotations I've read indicate, the spectacle marked a victory that had restored the Union, cleansed it of slavery, ensured the viability of democracy, and vanquished forces, as they saw them, of Southern oligarchy inimical to the intent of the founding generation. U.S. armies had shouldered the burden of suppressing the rebellion, and those on parade in Washington could claim more achievements on storied battlefields than any others. During the past year alone, these armies, the ones that marched on those 2 days, had captured Atlanta, had captured Richmond, cut a swath through Georgia and the Carolinas, and forced the Army of Northern Virginia and its famous commander to surrender. And P.S. also forced Joseph E. Johnston and his command to surrender, but who cares? Americans who regarded the Grand Review in such terms could not have anticipated that future generations might take a far different view. Yet much of the scholarly literature finds in the events of May 23rd, 24th a template for what was wrong with the war's winning cause. Too militaristic, too avowedly nationalist, and most troubling, too white. Such scholarship contends the review laid bare the flawed nature of the Union triumph. Strip away the waving flags and celebratory chest thumping, and what remained was a soon-to-be reunited nation that looked much like the racist, exclusionary, oppressive United States of the pre-war era. Let me give you a few quick quotations to illustrate this phenomenon in the literature. One study of American patriotism deemed the review, quote, a ritualization of male warrior heroism on a national scale. Nationalists used the parade to commemorate the war's achievement and make mythic heroes out of the boys in blue rather than dwell on the horrors of war. This author also labeled the event, quote, a ritualized occasion for emphasizing the gender divide between marching men in uniforms and thousands of women along Pennsylvania Avenue who were, quote, spatially and symbolically removed to the sidelines. Finally, this study found an emphasis on famous Union victories deeply troubling. Quote, directly in front of the White House, flags and bunting ominously inscribed with names of battlefields covered the principal reviewing stand. This last quibble stems from the fact that the reviewing stand featured banners bearing the names of Union victories, such as Shiloh, Petersburg, Donelson, and Richmond. They changed them. They had Western victories up when Sherman's armies marched. They had Eastern victories up when the Army of the Potomac marched. The absence of United States colored troops, USCT units, on May 23rd and 24th has received the most attention by far. One study thought it most significant, quote, that there were no black regiments represented in either Meade's or Sherman's armies. Though viewed as an emblem of a nation reborn, the review's racial exclusion was disturbingly reminiscent of the old Union. Another historian deplored, quote, the exclusion from the parade of the black Union regiments, a feature that in turn sent a clear message about the sort of Union the white veterans felt they had preserved. And continuing the exclusionary theme, the second author, I think quite amazingly, also noted that people, quote, who watched from the sidewalks, women, children, men who had never enlisted, were obvious enough exclusions under the circumstances. Finally, a moral history of the war, that's the author's language, not mine, observed, in a dark omen of what was to become of race relations in the reunited nation, no black military units were included in the parades. Perhaps the most detailed treatment of the review, while not remarking on the absence of USCT units, presented the event as a public sanctioning of Sherman's particular style of brutal warfare, a festive tribute to militarism and violence in which the destructive capacity of the soldiers invigorated the mass of adoring observers. How should we reconcile these different ways to gauge the importance of the Grand Review? Let me start with the most frequently mentioned criticism, the absence of United States colored troops. This is actually easily explained, although evidence underpinning the explanation is almost always overlooked. We must start with recognition that although we often date the end of the war at April 9th at Appomattox, the conflict had not officially ended by the third week of May, 1865. Anyone hoping to understand the origins and composition of the Grand Review must keep in mind that rebel forces remained active in the Trans-Mississippi Theater, that a French puppet regime in Mexico posed a potential threat, and that United States soldiers also were needed east of the Mississippi River to maintain order and oversee details of the transition from war to peace. For many, many thousands of the 1 million United States soldiers under arms in the Confederacy in May 1865, there remained work to do in dealing with the last spasms of the slaveholders' rebellion. Although difficult to imagine in light of the scale and impact of the review, it had an ad hoc dimension that dictated which troops would be present. Put together quickly, the review was limited to units in the immediate vicinity of Washington, D.C., namely Meade's and Sherman's armies. The fact that the Army of the Potomac, the Army of Georgia, and the Army of the Tennessee contained no USCT units largely explains the absence of black soldiers on May 23rd and 24th. As late as May 16th, Ulysses S. Grant didn't know whether there was going to be a review or not. And Sherman didn't hear anything definitive until May 19th. And he heard about it by reading a newspaper. That prompted him to chide Chief of Staff John A. Rawlins, quote, "I'm old-fashioned and prefer to see orders through some other channel. But if newspapers are the new fashion, so be it." Could organizers have delayed the event to make certain that black troops could march? Of course they could. The answer to that is yes. They also could have waited to summon from other theaters representative white units with as much claim to be in the parade as the ones that were in the parade. Units such as the 6th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, left in Southside Virginia after Appomattox, or the 4th Corps of George H. Thomas's Army of the Cumberland, stationed in Nashville. Those two come immediately to mind. Never mind the sailors. The latter, the 4th Corps, indeed, was a much bloodied organization that had fought in the Tennessee and Georgia campaigns of 1863-64 and deferred to no other unit in its battle honors or service to the Republic. And there were 50,000 sailors, some of them actually very close to Washington at the end of May 1865. They are not there either. Working on a short timetable, planners opted to stage the event with the Republic's greatest and most famous armies, and then get the men on their way home. Another factor that's at play here is that these men, these 150,000 men that are around Washington, want to go home, and they want to go home now, not later. Their attitude is, we came forward to deal with the threat to the nation. The threat to the nation is over. We're not soldiers, we're citizens who are doing our patriotic duty. Send us home. We've done what we enlisted to do. Send us home. Now. Why were there no black units near Washington, D.C.? Another question that some of you might have in your mind, and here's the answer. In early December 1864, all of the USCT units in the Department of Virginia and North Carolina had been consolidated in the 25th Corps, which was assigned to the Army of the James. Commanded by Godfrey Weitzel, the Corps had served alongside the Army of the Potomac during the Appomattox campaign and then had been sent to City Point at the confluence of the James and Appomattox rivers. Many of you have been there, I'm sure. In early May, before anyone was thinking seriously about a grand review, all the detached companies and regiments of African American soldiers in the Department of Virginia were ordered to report to Weitzel. On May 18th, Grant issued instructions to Weitzel to prepare his corps to rendezvous with white units under Major General Frederick Steele in Mobile, Alabama, after which the 25th Corps would continue on to the Rio Grande frontier. Grant deemed that duty a high national priority because thousands of French regulars, more than 30,000 of them had been sent to Mexico, posed a potential threat. The Monroe Doctrine had essentially been put in abeyance by this great war that was waged in the United States. And France took advantage of that and set up a puppet regime in Mexico, as many of you know. Set aside the government of Benito Juarez, sent 30,000 French regulars to Mexico and installed a puppet regime under one of the idiot Habsburgs. And so that's what you have in Mexico. Philip H. Sheridan is the one who was going to lead this expedition to Texas and to the Rio Grande frontier. He was behind only Grant and Sherman among heroes on the United States side at the end of the Civil War. Philip Henry Sheridan is number 3. He received word from Grant on May 17th to hurry westward, quote, to restore Texas and that part of Louisiana held by the enemy to the Union in the shortest practicable time. Because of the French military presence in Mexico, Grant also alerted Sheridan that, quote, a heavy force should be put on the Rio Grande. The 25th Corps is now available, and to it should be added a force of white troops now under Major General Steele. Sheridan asked for permission to put off his departure long enough so he could lead his troops in the review. He explained later, I had a strong desire to head my command on that great occasion. Although Grant was very fond of his young lieutenant, he refused with the comment that, quote, it is absolutely necessary to go at once. It's worth noting that black units had been included in the processions at Lincoln's second inaugural and at his funeral in Washington, D.C. There are black soldiers in both of those, sort of in the very front of those who marched at the second inaugural. The New York Times, a solidly Republican sheet, pronounced, quote, very silly and scarcely worthy of notice the idea that black units had been barred from the review. William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, the nation's leading abolitionist newspaper, examined the issue carefully and found the charge, quote, that brave colored troops had been debarred from participation in the late military review to be groundless. There have been no Negro troops in the Army of the Potomac for nearly a year, observed Garrison, who also accurately described Sherman's black pioneers who, quote, marched shoulder to shoulder in the review with their white comrades under the same flag. Some newspapers did refer to the absence of African American soldiers as well as to the presence of the black pioneers with Sherman's armies. Most manifested a clear understanding of why no USCT men marched on May 23rd and 24th. Noah Brooks wrote for the Sacramento Daily Union, and he recorded that some people in the crowd wondered why they didn't see black units. Brooks explained, this is because of the fact that all the colored troops are massed at City Point preparatory to being sent to Texas. They would have had a welcoming cheer from the brilliant assembly today, no doubt, added Brooks, for they have deserved and have earned the plaudits of a generous people. The black units were not there because there were none near Washington, because there were things to do in Texas, and as part of that second part, most of the USCT men had enlisted in 1864. Their enlistments are going to run for much longer. Most of the white troops had enlisted much earlier. They're due to get out sooner. So on those grounds, it made more sense as well because you didn't know how long you were going to have to keep troops along the Rio Grande or in Texas or dealing with what was left of the Confederate rebellion elsewhere. The modern complaint about the strident nationalism displayed on May 23rd and 24th seems scarcely worth addressing to me, but I'm going to press forward. More than 1/3 United States soldiers had perished in an effort to restore the nation. A democratic republic with a franchise quite narrow by our current standards. Women and most black men could not vote. Only 5 states allowed black men to vote, 5 northern states. But it was a breathtakingly broad franchise within a mid-19th century transatlantic context. Participants and observers at the review predictably cheered the nation's survival as a democratic beacon in a world yet to embrace the idea of government by the people. The New York Herald captured the triumphal character of most public and private reactions to the Grand Review. Blue-clad soldiers, noted the Herald, have secured the perpetuity of that union, upon which the hopes of the oppressed of all climes and countries depend. They are champions of free government throughout the world. Again, echoing the last best hope of earth formulation of Lincoln. Finally, grousing about the review as a militaristic ritual completely misses a crucial point. The deeply anti-militaristic American tradition, rooted in opposition to professional military soldiers during the colonial and revolutionary eras, absolutely stood out in coverage of the event. Americans didn't trust regular armies. They didn't want a large regular army. They thought regular armies could easily pose a threat to individual liberties and freedoms in a republic. Anybody that I get so... This is an aside, but I don't care. There's enough time for a brief aside. All anybody has to do is look at the Second Amendment to understand this. The Second Amendment has a very, very specific purpose. The United States disliked regular armies so much that it wasn't going to have one in the new nation. The United States Army numbered 700 men in the early 1790s. 700 men in the United States. What's the United States going to depend on? A well-regulated militia that will be pulled in from the states, and it isn't even going to supply weapons for those guys. They're going to have to bring their own muskets. And so, of course, they have to have the right to bear arms because they're going to be called into military service and told to bear your arm when you come in here and join. That's what the Second Amendment is about. It's about this deeply rooted mistrust of a professional, regular army in the United States, which is the antithesis of the concept of the citizen soldier. The citizen soldier is not a threat to the nation. The citizen soldier is what will save the nation in that kind of threat. And victory here belonged to citizen soldiers who wanted nothing more than to put aside their weapons and return to civilian life. These are only dutiful American citizens, italicized, commented one newspaper that articulated a common theme, coming home to disband after a long and successful work on behalf of their country. One reporter quoted an Englishman in the crowd who said he'd never seen a more impressive military parade. And this Englishman added, the grandeur of it all is that these men are citizens. A Baltimore paper placed the veterans' work, quote, alongside the events of the revolutionary generation, and singled out the significance of the transition from soldier to citizen. The soldier of yesterday is the citizen of today. And I can't help observing that the complaint that the review was too militaristic is sort of odd when you're talking about the review of national armies that had just suppressed a rebellion. It's bound, those armies are bound to convey a sense of military power, I think. Even if you're trying to resist that, they're probably going to. The Grand Review represented a moment to look back and ahead. Back to the military labors of more than 2 million men who put on blue uniforms during the war, and ahead to a reinvigorated republic in which veterans and fellow citizens would play out their lives. If we're to understand the review and what it tells us about the meaning of the conflict for those who waged and experienced it, we should engage the wartime generation on their ground with careful attention to the factors in play in May 1865. Questions or comments or anything you want to argue about? Yes.
Two questions.
Two questions, but you only get one.
Well, where was Grant? Maybe on the reviewing stand?
Grant was right on the reviewing stand. Yes, he was.
And the second one is what?
And William Tecumseh Sherman ended up on the reviewing stand and managed to snub people he didn't like there, but go ahead.
And Washington was a southern town.
It was.
So the local citizenry, you know, they would have mixed feelings.
Well, some of them would, sure, yeah.
Did that show in any way?
Well, none of the accounts that I've read talked about sullen pro-Confederates throwing eggs at the guys who were marching by, if that's what you mean. I don't get any, I get no sense of any overt pro-Confederate response to the marching of 150,000 U.S. soldiers on those 2 days. No, I don't. Washington, of course, had gotten much, much, much larger during the Civil War, and the people who swelled the population of the city were not pro-Confederates for the most part. Although nearby there were plenty. Baltimore had lots of them, including one who shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head. Yes. You right there? Yes, you had your hand up.
Do you have any stories about the Western and Eastern soldiers fighting each other before the parade?
Yes, there are. The Western and Eastern soldiers, there's a lot of comment, and I left it out of here, because I think some of it, I think just sort of reflected notions that people had and that were based on not much. There are notions that Western men are different from Eastern men. They're rangier, they're taller, they're sort of more tanned than the Eastern men. That one makes no sense to me at all. It's really hot and sunny in Petersburg, just like it is in Atlanta. The notion to be more tanned in Georgia than you would be in Virginia doesn't make sense. There are accounts of a few fistfights between soldiers in the Western armies and those in the Eastern armies. It was clear that the Western armies took a more casual approach to how they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. The Army of the Potomac put on a better, more formal show than Sherman's armies did, and Sherman's soldiers loved that. That showed they were better, they said, and they were more American than the Eastern soldiers who were full of themselves but had never done any real fighting. They argued about that. A member of the Second Corps in the Army of the Potomac said, yes, we didn't do all that much fighting, just more than all of your armies put together did. So they each had, and the Second Corps in the Army of the Potomac was actually right. It suffered more casualties by far than any other corps in any other army anywhere, not even close. The Army of the Potomac had an overwhelming majority of the regiments that suffered the highest casualties, the brigades that suffered the highest casualties. The Army of the Potomac is the bloodiest army by far in the United States. But they did argue about that. They got into some fist fights. I'm going to stick my neck out and say probably some soldiers in the Army of the Potomac got in fist fights among themselves while they were in Washington, if they had access to liquor, which they did.
That's what I, yeah.
Yes.
Can you comment on any review by a Southern newspaper of the Grand Review?
You know, I didn't even look at Southern newspapers, so I'm sure that some of them, who knows what they were up to. I can't answer that. Can't answer that, yes.
Did black papers talk about the review?
They did. They talked about the review and not in a nasty way. There's not, this is, the complaint comes mainly from recent scholarship, not from, people at the time understood. I looked at, there are accounts by black correspondents. Richard Blackett edited one of them, one of the most common ones, and he went and talked to a lot of the black soldiers in the 25th Corps. They actually took pride in the fact that they were being sent to the Rio Grande. They thought that was a position of honor. We're being sent to the national frontier to deal with a potential threat from another country to the United States. They didn't see that as horrible duty. They saw that as duty that showed that someone trusted them enough to go and do that. I think the fact that their enlistments had a much longer time to run had more to do with it than that, but at any rate, that is what testimony I could dig up, and there's not nearly as much testimony from black observers as there are from white ones, of course, but the testimony I did find, including from black journalists, doesn't have a sense of their feeling put upon because they weren't in the Grand Review. The fact that they were at both Lincoln's funeral procession and at the inaugural procession absolutely, I think, gives the lie to the notion that there's some cabal in Washington that wants to make sure no black soldiers get any credit for anything. They're in both of those other, and some of the soldiers who complained the most among the ones that I found who weren't present were the 6th Corps men from the Army of the Potomac. Why the hell don't we get to be there? They said all the rest of our army is there. Well, why don't? Well, because you're down. Because you're not there. That's why you're not in the march. You're not there. Yes.
Where on the review stand, were there any black dignitaries such as?
I don't know who all was on the reviewing stand. I wouldn't be surprised if there weren't any black dignitaries on the reviewing stand, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Don't know. Yes.
Where was Lee?
Where was Lee? Who the hell cares? He went back to Richmond after Appomattox.
So he didn't partake in any of this?
No, he's the...
Union soldiers on these reviews?
These are only Union soldiers because they're the ones who saved the nation that Lee almost under... No, they're no...
I thought they all were.
No Confederate soldiers in the Grand Review unless one of them, you know, got a blue uniform and sneaked in, but I don't even think that would have been allowed. No. It's like there are no Confederate soldiers in national cemeteries. Why not? Well, anyway, yes.
If Sherman found out about his order to march in the review from the newspaper, who actually did the planning for the Grand Review?
Well, it's our Secretary of War, our favorite upbeat fellow bundle of joy, Stanton, who is doing a lot of the thinking about this, and he and Sherman, of course, loathed each other. Stanton and Sherman. Stanton is the one that Sherman snubbed. Stanton was a difficult buckaroo in a lot of ways, but he's the one who did most of the planning. Sherman, and the soldiers, I mean, the soldiers really thought they were mustered near Washington. They thought they were just going to go home. And then they did this, and they enjoyed it for the most part, but some of them even complained about it. We've got to get cleaned up, we've got to do this, we've got to march, we've got to do this. I just want to go home. Yes?
The South had any kind of...
No, there are no Grand Reviews in the South. And that would have been frowned upon. I'm going to again stick my neck out. If I were a United States commander in Richmond and found out there was going to be a parade of Confederate soldiers in Richmond, I think I probably would have said, I don't think so. Don't think we're going to do that. Yes.
What are your primary sources for tonight's speech?
My primary sources for tonight's speech are several dozen newspapers that I followed and individual accounts from people who participated. That's all my sources. They're diaries, letters. Almost all of those that I quoted are contemporary. They're within a few days or at most 2 or 3 weeks of when the events took place. Sherman's memoirs I quoted there later. I quoted from Sheridan's memoirs together with more contemporary documents there as well. But probably 95% of the words I read to you tonight were written by people who were either in the march or watching the march and wrote about it within a week or so. And so that they're very fresh takes on what went on. Yes, in the back and then back up here.
Thanks. So even though this was hastily put together, do you think after Appomattox, did President Lincoln have a conversation with Stanton
No.
to say, we're going to do this?
No, I don't. I don't think Lincoln, I don't think he did. Yes.
How did they feed all the soldiers? That's a lot of guys.
How did they what?
Feed them.
How did they feed them? Well, they know how to feed them. The war's been going on. And that's a great question. That's a great question. And it's also one for us to think about. And a nice way, I've always told my students that a good way to think about the logistical challenges that these commanders faced is just realize that every time the Army of the Potomac stopped for the night, it was the second largest city in the Confederacy. Only New Orleans was larger than the Army of the Potomac. And you had to feed all of those men and 35,000 horses and mules that allowed the Army to move. And every horse and every mule, every horse gets 26 pounds of food a day, and every mule gets 25. And so think about that a minute, and then wonder why mules have an attitude. But anyway, you've got all of these men and all of those animals, but they know how to do that, and they're right in Washington. A lot of railroads come into Washington. You can carry lots of stuff in there and pass it out. Yes?
The idea of the Grand Review is, am I correct in saying Lincoln was not Lincoln's?
This is not Lincoln's idea, no.
Was Stanton's completely?
It's Stanton's mainly, and to read Stanton's, Stanton is the principal one who's pushing it, yes. And it's a good idea. I mean, there's never been anything like this before in the United States. We're used to them now. I mean, there were big, after World War I, great big ones, after World War II, great big ones, and so forth. But this is the first one. There were smaller ones held in other places, and there was, in Pennsylvania, they had a review of USCT men later. So there are various, the 4th Corps that I mentioned, Thomas's Corps, had its own grand review in Nashville. You had other examples, but none approached this one. None in size or coverage or importance. Yes?
I'm reading the question you gave me. What is your latest book, and are you willing to sell it?
My latest book has nothing to do with the Civil War. My latest book, you asked me a question, I'm going to give you an answer.
That's what I want to know.
I'm going to edit my mother's diary and memoir of her time in the Navy, in a Navy USO show in the Pacific in World War II. She was in a show that was headed by a star named Eddie Bracken, who was a kind of a big star for a brief time, did a couple of famous comedies. Eddie Bracken had a show that was in the Pacific. They left LA my mother lived in Los Angeles. She was an entertainer in Los Angeles. They were in the Pacific from late June through early August. They were on Guam and Tinian and Saipan and Peleliu. I mean, they were on islands when there were still Japanese soldiers on some of the islands, and they entertained. Their estimate was 750,000 soldiers, sailors, and Marines in the course of this time. They named a B-29 after my mother and painted her picture on the side. And Admiral Byrd, Richard Evelyn Byrd, the explorer, took the stars off his coat and gave them to my mother, which I still took. Untold photographs of this show. And so the photographs were just, they're wonderful. There's my mom with wounded guys in hospitals and in mess halls with guys and in front of Japanese caves and holding captured flags. And it's an incredible. A friend of mine at the National Archives even found 2 brief bits of film of the Bracken show on Guam. And so I can look there and see my mom, my 22-year-old mother, come out. Eddie Bracken helps her put her accordion on, and she starts singing and playing. It's surrealistic. Surrealistic. It really is. Yes?
Question on your primary, one of your primary sources, the abolitionist paper, The Liberator, and mentioning that there have been no black troops in the Army of the Potomac in well over a year. What about Burnside's division at the Battle of the Crater? How that division became morphed into the 25th Corps in December.
Right. They were Burnside's Corps. Burnside, of course, was separate from the Army of the Potomac. He's not. There are 3 corps in the Army of the Potomac, and the 9th Corps isn't one of them. So they're fighting with the Army of the Potomac. They're not in the Army of the Potomac. The USCT guys see their first real action on June 15th outside Petersburg as they come down in the race to Petersburg, and they had great success on June 15th. Took their first heavy casualties, had scenes fresh in their minds, pretty fresh in their minds is Fort Pillow and the No Quarter at Fort Pillow, and there are well-documented examples of the USCT men on June 15th outside Petersburg executing Confederate prisoners and saying and chanting Fort Pillow, Fort Pillow. I mean, it's their first real, there are some black soldiers with the Army of the Potomac at the time of Spotsylvania, but they're not in action at Spotsylvania, they're in the rear areas. The first time they're really in action is on June 15th, at the very first phase of the fighting at Petersburg, and then of course very prominent at the crater. Yes?
Were there any Michigan soldiers in the ground review?
I'm sure there were, but I don't have all the regiments memorized. If there were any Michigan soldiers in Sherman's armies, there are Michigan soldiers. And of course, there's one regiment of Michigan soldiers in the Iron Brigade. 24th Michigan is in the Iron Brigade. So yeah, there are Michigan guys there.
And what was the name of the woman that you...
None of the headlines I saw said, Michigan Men Parade and also other troops there.
Well, what was the name of the woman that you mentioned?
Bickerdike. Bickerdike is her last name, Bickerdike.
Mary Ann.
Yes, her name is Mary, and they called her Mother Bickerdike, the soldiers did. She was widely known in the Western armies, and many people commented on the fact that she got to ride in the Grand Review. She rode in the Grand Review with the 15th Corps, which had been Sherman's old command. Yes?
I was just wondering along those lines, because Sherman's men, the boys, they knew Mother Bickerdike. She was their mother, she traveled with them all the way down to Atlanta and everything. But going to the parade in Washington, being the only woman, how would the rest of the dignitaries or Washington or the people from the East view this woman riding in a parade with the military?
I didn't see any comment that went beyond acknowledging that she was there. No any kind of editorial take on it, or there she was, and there she went, and that's, I didn't see it. One more? No more? Thank you.